The Bible says that we should be on guard against false teachers and be ready to call them out when needed. But how do we practically do this in the local church? Join us today as we talk about practical ways to weed out the wolves. Welcome to the Happy Holy Hour, a podcast where everyday Christians grow in their faith through biblical examination and insightful discussion. I'm glad you're here today. If you enjoy the content you're about to hear, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and visit us at thehappyholyhour.org. Let's get started. Travis, I have a question for you. Have you ever been in a situation where, or have heard of a situation where a quote unquote wolf was removed from your local church? Now, I'm not talking about the four-legged dog. I'm talking about. I was going to
say, yeah, they're not like in the Northeast where we're at least in this location. They're not, I don't even think they've been reintroduced or anything like that in Pennsylvania.
Not in Pennsylvania.
I know of. Maybe not. I don't know. There are a lot of things, offshoot story, like when they say, oh, those things they're not in this area and stuff. So like, where I grew up in upstate New York, they were like, oh, there's no mountain lions here. And like hunters would have it. Like we had a mountain lion that was like on camera around our properties and everything. And like our neighbors all and whatever. All those people were like, oh no, they're not there and everything. So don't always trust them. Maybe there is a wolf in your area.
Do you know how you can solve that? Trail cams.
You know how you can solve that? We'll talk about 6 ways to keep the wolves out of your church.
Yes, we're talking about wolves that are people, false teachers, or basically people that pose a threat to your congregation. And not an actual wolf like an animal, but someone who poses a threat to the sheep.
Yes, I had to watch myself here because I have the bad habit of saying like wolves, like woofs, like woof woof, like a dog. So
it's
this
the
whole
Canadian
time,
in you.
Yeah, this whole time I'm going to have to be like pausing, thinking, looking at how it's spelled, wolves. So so going back to your question, I haven't been in a situation where a wolf or a false teacher has been removed from my church. I mean, obviously, I've heard of these stories, but no, I haven't been in that situation directly.
Yeah, I mean, we've all heard the horror stories. One of the things that's been really popular as of late has been the story of Mark Driscoll, in particular. But that's a whole different topic. But the idea of a wolf being in your local church is kind of scary. Think about it, right? You have the sheep, which are generally not totally helpless, but pretty much helpless. And you have wolves that enter the congregation that can just really tear things apart and cause a lot of harm, a lot of damage, a lot of division within the church body. So how do you practically weed out the wolves? How do you keep those personalities, those people from coming into your congregation and ripping it apart? Now, we know Christ preserves his church, right? There's that absolute confidence and the promise that Christ will never abandon his bride, that he has covenanted himself to her, to the church. And because of that, we cannot be destroyed as the body of Christ. However, there are definitely horror stories of local congregations that are not healthy churches that have problems, and sometimes it does lead to the death of a local body. So how do we prevent that kind of thing from happening?
Yeah. And can I just insert here before we get going into the body of our episode, and maybe I should have inserted this into the pre-intro, because if there are listeners who have been listening to all of our previous episodes, they might think that we're kind of beating a dead horse here, because we did several other episodes dealing with false teaching and kind of similar titles here. So they might kind of be tempted to skip over and be like, oh, this is repeat content. But just several comments on that. One is that each of the episodes is pretty distinctively different. Yes, it's dealing with wolves in the church and false teaching, but we did one on what is false teaching, so defining it. What do we mean by that? and what are false teachers. And then we did with how do you deal with false teachers and false teaching. And today is more of a proactive, like how do you avoid that? And how do you kind of feel it out in the church and see if it's going on? And then really it's more of proactive. How do you avoid those things from happening in the first place? So it kind of like is a bookend to, it wasn't even a mini series. It was just kind of leads me into point two, is that it's something that we've seen going on a lot in the church today, especially the Western church, which is kind of the culture in which we live. And so it's something that's been heavy on our hearts and has been very concerning. So fits in with the nature of why we created this podcast, what we saw in our culture and in our church, things that affect our Christian life. So we thought it was important to talk about a lot, since the Bible talks about it a lot. So we're not trying to beat a dead horse. That's not our intention. If you want to, maybe if this is your first time listening to one of our, I think there were 3 episodes. This will make 3 episodes on false teaching. It might be helpful to go back real quick, listen to those ones in order, and this kind of finishes up, wraps up. I'm sure we're going to talk about it some here and there in the future, but this kind of bookends our official episodes dealing specifically with this topic. So
yeah, it's a great point, Travis. And today's episode is actually based on an article written by Costi Hinn, who started For the Gospel. It's a ministry. We've done one previous episode going through an article of theirs, and they just put things in a very easy to understand way. And they've been generous enough to allow us to talk through some of these articles. So this one was written by Costi Hinn. It's titled 6 Ways to Weed Out Wolves. And basically, they're practical ways to proactively keeping those wolves from getting in and destroying the local congregation. So we're just gonna read it and pretty much discuss it as we go.
Yeah, and one neat thing with Costi is he came out of the prosperity gospel culture. I think it's his uncle, right? Benny Hinn. False teacher, prosperity gospel preacher. And so Costi came out that he knows the dangers of it, which is why he's passionate about it. It also gives him he's very truthful, and he's not afraid to step on toes, if that makes sense, where others are, because he knows the reality of it and how destructive it is. But he also has this grace about him too, where he understands for the people who get caught up in that. And so I just think he has a very good approach when dealing with these issues. So it's just one thing in case people, are like, oh, well, you don't really understand all these things. No, he really does. He came from that environment. So, which is why it's super important to him. So,
yeah. So we're just going to get started reading here, and we'll kind of interject and talk as we go. First sentence of the article says, "The greatest threat to the church is not the blowing winds of culture from the outside, but false teachers who infiltrate from the inside. Those who look like sheep but are actually wolves. Those posing as shepherds, but are charlatans. These false teachers will most certainly be conduits of cultural ideologies, while at the same time spewing licentious lies and exploiting people with their greed."
Yeah, I like that. Obviously, both can be dangerous, and that's what he's saying. But even if you go to just think very practically about the analogies used in scripture and the analogies he's using here based on the Bible. Obviously wolves are dangerous. Wolves are wolves, right? If you're a sheep, but what's more dangerous, a wolf outside of the fence, or a wolf inside the pasture, the sheepfold, who looks like a sheep that you're not, aware of or ready to be on guard against. So obviously they're both dangerous, but that's what I think makes false teachers and false teaching so dangerous. He says that they're going to bring in these cultural ideologies. Obviously, the world's going to have these cultural ideologies, which are dangerous, but they bring them into the church. When you have a church proclaiming the truth, it's easy to call out cultural ideologies for what they are, but these false teachers are going to bring them in, and they take what should be black and white and they want to call it gray, which reminds me of that Progressive Christian YouTube channel, God is Gray, that we talked about on Progressive Christianity. They want to mix these things and twist the truth, and that's what makes it so deceptive. And they know the language, they know the Christian culture, right? And so they cause the church to really become more like the world. which is especially evident in modern times, as we pointed out when we were dealing with liberal and progressive Christianity. So we had a recent episode on that, so you can go back and listen to that one for more on that. But yeah, that's what makes false teachers so deceptive. Think of that picture, that analogy. There's wolves outside the sheepfold, right? But we have that barrier, and they're clearly wolves. What happens when you have one inside the sheepfold that looks like the sheep that you're not looking out for? So
dangerous stuff, man. It absolutely is a powerful analogy. But back to the article, it says, this is the heading. I can almost hear people saying this. I know you don't want to talk about false teachers, but it says,
tone of voice.
Yeah, I can hear the tone coming through. But it says, talking about spiritual threats in the church can be uncomfortable for some people. I was recently in a conversation with another pastor who remarked, I would much rather focus on good things and the good news rather than strike fear in the hearts of our churchgoers with doom and gloom remarks about false teachers. And while I understand the sentiment, Scripture is our authority, not peddling to consumers or mitigating reality, even with the best intentions. We don't pick from the menu of pastoral options and decide, I'll take the easy parts of church life for my main course with a side of no controversy. No one who is enlisted as an under-shepherd of Christ gets to pick and choose their job duties like they're walking through a buffet. We are servants of Christ, not ourselves. Yes, we want to major in the good things and in the good news, yet more often than we'd hope, we will find ourselves muttering Jude's words as he agonized, Beloved, while I was giving all diligence to write unto you of our common salvation, I was constrained to write unto you, exhorting you to contend earnestly for the faith, which was once for all delivered unto the saints.
I feel that. I feel Jude there.
Yeah, man. The frustration, right?
Yeah.
You could just feel it. But it's an important reminder, Travis, right? That calling out false teaching is a biblical mandate, right? It's not something we can just decide to do one day and not do the next.
Yeah.
We're called to be actively looking out for that.
Yeah, and that's one reason it's so bewildering to me in some ways that pastors shy away from it. At the same time, I understand not wanting to deal with even more confrontation. Like, pastors have a lot on their plate. They're dealing with unhappy people left and right all the time, not dealing with false teaching, and just my personality and not liking confrontation very much. I understand that. And at the same time, it's easy for us on a podcast where obviously we have multiple listeners with different opinions going to listen to this. But when it's you and me just talking, we agree on this. And so it's easier for us to say it in this virtual format. It's harder to, have to be the one actually dealing with it on the front line. So giving grace there. At the same time, it is a biblical mandate. And, like Paul says, many of you desire, but not many of you should, because it is a higher calling. They're held to a higher standard. So it's not something that they can just pick and choose. Like, it is something they have to do as a biblical mandate, which is why we're talking about it today. Yeah. And I wonder if it's even more evident now, like shying away from calling out false teachers, because not causing emotional and psychological harm for the individual, right? And really for the congregation, this kind of therapeutic church in a way, has become the ultimate goal for most of society today, including a lot of churches and pastors. And we've mentioned some of this is coming from The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self that we talked about on here before. I know, Tyler, you're reading through that right now, as am I. Really helpful book. But I wonder if some of that comes into play and just makes it even more prevalent. But like we said, calling out false teaching is a biblical mandate. But, it's also, this is another reason why I'm not sure I quite get this argument, because calling out false teaching is an opportunity to again proclaim the good news, and we're calling people back to the truth of the gospel. So it's not like, oh, we're just focusing on all the bad. Like, we have to do that in order to preserve the true gospel undefiled, but it's an opportunity to call them back to that and to proclaim the good news. So it's not an either or.
We've talked about that before, where exposing false teaching is actually a chance to gain unity on the gospel rather than what many people think, and that's just to cultivate divisiveness. Which if you want to learn more about that, go back and listen to that episode on is it biblical?
Shout outs to our previous.
Whoa, everything's connecting.
Whoa, man!
But back to our article. The heading for this section is "This is the pastoral normal." Whether you like it or not, protecting the flock from false teachers is a pastoral normal. In Acts 20, 29 through 31, Paul tells the elders what is going to occupy a steady portion of their time. He warned, "I know that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock, and from among your own selves men will arise, speaking perverse things to draw away the disciples after them. Therefore, be on the alert, remembering that night and day for a period of 3 years I did not cease to admonish each one with tears." There's no question. Threats will constantly come against the church from the inside, and the goal will be to draw sheep out of the fold. Therefore, alertness is mandated. Jesus himself warned in Matthew 7, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves." Does the local church ministry sound like fun and games? Is pastoral ministry about being a glorified event planner who employs pragmatic gimmicks to keep the people coming back? Not even close. We need more pastors who take their job seriously and leave the Americanized, consumer-driven antics to the local business owner trying to get you to buy his new coffee blend. As false teachers and wolves circle your ranks as a church, you don't have to be scared. Many happy leaders major on good news and good things, yet they know how to turn on the switch and pull out the sword. There are also systems that you can put into place within your church that can help mitigate threats and help you be proactive instead of reactive. So here are 6 steps you can start taking today to weed out the wolves. Number 1, refuse to partner with them in any way. False teachers wouldn't have such a wide reach if we'd stop platforming them, right? If you want to guard your church against false teachers and wolves, stop partnering with them for any purpose whatsoever. Travis, before we get into discussion on this, the first thing I'm reminded of, and we've talked about this a lot, so I'm not going to beat this dead horse, but the first thing I'm reminded of is what worship songs are we singing in church on Sunday, right? Are we platforming Bethel Church? Are we platforming Hillsong? Are we platforming Elevation? Now, that's the one thing that's going to step on the most toes here. But simply put, right, if we're partnering with them in this ministry, we're platforming them. We are basically communicating to our congregation that they are theologically trustworthy and doctrinally trustworthy, when that's just not the case, right? But yeah, what are your thoughts on this section?
Yeah, it's kind of tough too, because as I was reading through this, I was like wondering. It kind of sounds like cancel culture in a way.
It does,
And so, how do you think doing this, or how do you do this without getting accused of cancel culture? And ultimately, you maybe will either way, and it doesn't matter. But like, how do they differ? Because both is about deplatforming.
Yeah.
But I think for this one, the difference is here, we're doing it in obedience to God. Yeah. We're not doing it for our own purposes. We're doing it because it's the Christ-honoring right thing to do that God's commanded us to do. So, I mean, I think that's the difference there. I know, like, cancel culture, there are negative aspects to it, right? And there are appropriate times in the public square to hear differing opinions. And I think that's where cancel culture can get so dangerous, right? Where we don't allow people to, for people to hear both sides and everything. And we just deplatform someone if we don't like what they're saying. So in the public marketplace, that's fine. But it's totally different when it's coming from our pulpits and within. And exactly. I mean, there's a lot of things that come into play here. Like, where is the line on what you will partner on or with who? And then what do you say about those going to events and stuff, because they can be a source of truth, right? This happens all the time. Or I'm thinking of some people who would maybe not agree with Bethel and Hillsong and all those movements, but would go speak at these big, huge conventions and events where most of the people they would disagree with there, but they would go because they can be a source of truth there. And even people like Piper and stuff, who, you know, are relying on Chandler and everything like that. Personally, I think I'm not necessarily saying them wrong. I would probably act differently or choose differently. I probably wouldn't go. It's for the same reasons why some of the same reasons why people would say, well, you can just repurpose the lyrics, right? Now, I think for some of those lyrics, they may sound biblically solid, how they were interpreted and originated, and those authors has a probably completely different meaning. So I think there's that, but you're also platforming people and giving, whether you want to or not, you're giving validity to false teaching or false teachers. And you're not doing that. I don't think you're giving the appropriate weightiness to that false teaching. So I understand the sentiment, right? Where, well, all these people I think are false teachers, but if I go there, I can preach the truth to tens of thousands of people. And maybe that situation's a little different because I've heard like time after time of people who are caught up in those, under those false teachings. And then they heard someone like Piper or something like that. And that's how God got a hold of them and rescued them out of that, you know? So I don't know. That's a tough one.
There's definitely levels of discernment there that it's not, this particular issue may not be black and white, but I think like when you're thinking about in your local church congregation, it's definitely black and white there, right? Why would a shepherd willingly expose his sheep to wolves? Like, doesn't make any sense. Now, that's within the local church. I think that's pretty black and white.
Well, and that's an instance where if they invited you into their circles, that might be a little different than you inviting them into your circle, right?
Right.
Like if you have a solid convention or event that's based on solid biblical principles without false teaching, it'd be different for you to bring in a false teacher and platform them versus them bringing in you and platforming you. So, which, you know, some people may say it's unfair. I say, oh, well, I'll take, maybe I think that's probably how those people like Piper, maybe who view it says, well, I'll take that opportunity. I'm not going to do the same thing, but if they're going to give me the opportunity, I'll do it. So it is a little different, but I think what we're saying is very clear. I think this is what Kasi Hin is saying. I think he's more focused on the local church, but I do think this comes into play in the broader square too. There is a wisdom issue here. And my problem is some of these people may clearly and publicly take a stance for what is being proclaimed at these events and still go and speak. And some of them don't and almost kind of become buddy with them. And by that, and aren't willing to call them out on the false teaching and still go and speak there. So when you do that, then, you know, at what point are you calling out their false teaching? And
now imagine if let's go back in church history for a minute and imagine what would happen if they would have just gone along back our church fathers. What if they would have just gone along with proclaiming false teaching? You know, like you think about like right now in our modern day, you wrote this in our notes and it was just reminding me, we're dealing with like the Afghan issue right now where the Taliban is very actively seeking out Christians to kill. We would call those Christians martyrs, and they're being martyred by those of a different religion. But back in the day, there were Christians that were preaching false teachings that would be killed by people within Christianity that were trying to stand on the grounds of truth.
I mean, there are false teachers within Christianity.
Yes, that's. I apologize if they came out wrong, but it's just very interesting how just a few hundred years separates us from those actions.
Yeah, and really, that was a lot of church history, right? I mean, you had a very intense persecution by Rome and other parties in the early church. And then you have more modern times, you know, within recent years, it's been other religions. And of course, throughout you had other religions here and there, but there was a large chunk of church history when the majority of persecution towards biblical Christians was coming from like Roman Catholicism or other things. I was thinking of the Scottish Covenanters, and different people like that, and they were willing to lose their lives rather than compromise. And it wasn't some outside religion. So yeah, just think back and imagine if they weren't willing to do that, where we would be today.
The second step from the article, step 2 out of 6, when it comes to how to weed out the wolves, is this. It says, keep the standard for leadership and authority as high as the Bible does. 1 Timothy 3, 1-7 is typically the standard used to protect who gets authority in the church. But it's not uncommon to find the wrong men in leadership for the wrong reasons. Simply put, doctrine matters, but so does character. No matter what, keep the standard for leadership and authority as high as the Bible. Do not compromise because people give money, promise loyalty, or just seem genuine. Let the scripture be the bar, not your emotions or your opinions. This should include those who teaches the kids, right? The students, Sunday school, and those who have authority to make major decisions with money and church trajectory.
Yeah. And I mean, ultimately you can let that flow down to the average day lay people, right? I mean, we have a high standard as Christians. So that obviously, is, has application for all of us, but especially, those in leadership. I mean, the Bible talks about the qualifications for leaders constantly, and talks about these matters of dispelling false teachers constantly. It's all throughout there. It's a big deal. Like I said, this is why we're talking about it today. What's interesting is that as you read through the qualifications listed in the Bible for church leadership, many of the requirements deal not just with the ability to teach, but they deal with their character, and often in very personal ways, like how do you treat your family and lead in your home and things like that. So their character in every aspect of life has to be above reproach. Yeah. Before we go on, like it was interesting you pointed out even things like Sunday schools and kids ministries and things like that, because I think sometimes we let those go by the wayside a little bit, and we'll just chuck anybody in there depending on your church.
Like why are the youth pastors always the ones at the bottom of the totem pole, right? Like they always seem like the ones that like they get paid the least. Right. They have like their schedule is it's just crazy.
Least education, and I'm not saying like not always that they're the least educated, but in general, like a lot of places, like, oh, you don't have your we want an MDiv for your head pastor, but we don't want an MDiv for those teaching our children. Like, I'm not saying you have to have the MDiv, but I'm saying why is it that the bar is lower? Now I understand they're not going to be maybe the primary one up front teaching the whole congregation, but they're still a teacher and a pastor in the church. And so that's a whole nother very interesting topic. Maybe we'll dig into that.
Yeah.
Is that a biblical model? And are there some negative repercussions of letting that slide? Because then you also see like this whole shifting from youth pastor to becoming a main pastor, or just kind of striking out on your own. And I don't know, there's this whole thing there that it's like you said, it's all interconnected, man. It's all interconnected. I don't know, but I like that he brought that up. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that, Sunday school teachers have to be ordained elders in your church, but it is a good reminder to take all of that seriously, every avenue of teaching seriously, but we'll touch on that later. So carry on.
Even your small group leaders. Anyway, number three, the third step for weeding out the wolves is actively enforce the truth and time principles for key roles. Now, this is what the article says. I remember a man coming to our church several years ago who had a degree from a top seminary, and he insisted that we make him an elder because he was educated and he had more experience than most of the leaders on our team. However, it was a minimum of around 3 years to enter the elder process, and you had to be nominated, not self-appointed. Eventually, he huffed and he puffed and he didn't return. He was looking for power. So truth and time go hand in hand. Make people wait for major leadership opportunities. False teachers and wolves won't like that. That's a good point. That's actually something
that truth and time. That's a very practical but wise thing to do. Now, 3 years, honestly, like that's longer than even our denomination requires. I don't know exactly, like there may be contingencies on that and what that means.
Sure,
3 years, but I'm guessing he just means like a member of their church. But so like for our denomination, just to give some context of some just practical things we do, not saying every denomination has to do but my denomination, you have to be a member in good standing for at least 1 year. And then you have to go through officer training to be elected. Now that might be different if you're coming in as an officer from another like denomination or something. But in general, you have to go through officer training and then you have to be elected. So again, you can't be self-appointed, you have to be elected. So that's kind of the process we do for officers in the church. We have people, right now who are educated, who meet the biblical requirements for officers in the church, and who would or will make great officers of the church someday, but they don't meet these criteria that we've laid out, and maybe they just joined the church or something like that. And so they have to wait. And it kind of can sometimes seem cumbersome, and there is this like, oh, he would be such a good elder, such a good deacon, So, but you have to put on the brakes a little bit, and it is a good thing because it really helps get to know their character and who they really are, and just help avoid a lot of issues there. And yes, it can seem like, man, they're just timing wise, like we're going through this process right now, so it'd be really nice. But it's a good thing to be consistent and to have those parameters in place. I think that's a wise thing. I've seen it. I've been in churches and I've seen it that cause issues when they have someone come in and they become a deacon or an elder or some sort of leadership role in the church. And then they find out some serious character issues or, ongoing sin, all these different things. And it really hurts the church. Really, ultimately, it hurts the individual too, their families. So it's really good to be wise and be careful up front and picking these people and putting them in those places.
On the flip side, it's another issue when, say, you have a pastor in place that is hand selecting these elders, and especially if all of those elders might be like inside men, right? Or like maybe they're family members of the pastor, because I know we talked about this on our eldership episode way back, months ago, but that would be a red flag for me, if the pastor was hand selecting yes men or something that you push things through. Like it all looks good on paper. So it's one of those things where character matters not only for like the elders that you're picking or the deacons that you're electing, but also for that pastor shepherd that's already there. Just because they're the pastor in your church doesn't mean that you should stop and, basically trust everything that they say at their word. Now, they are our leaders. They are our shepherds. We should obey and submit. But just another red flag, I guess, to mention there.
Well, and I think this would be like more just across the board, right? That truth and time principle could be put in place for
anything,
electing
any office,
like a head pastor or however your church government works. That going through a careful examination process and doing your due diligence for any of that, and of course how your election process works. That's also important. The conflict of interest kind of, obviously it's not quite a corporation. So I'm not saying that if you have a head pastor, you can't have a brother as an elder. Maybe that is in a biological church or something. I'm not saying that's a wrong thing either, but what we are saying is, do your due diligence and don't be afraid to take things slow, which is something we Presbyterians are very good at.
Number 4 on the 6 steps or 6 ways to weed out the wolves is prudently purge the bookstore. Now, before I read this, Travis, this is probably one of my favorite ones.
I like
the article.
Yeah.
The article says, like parents who carefully fill the pantry and fridge with the right kind of food, churches should carefully curate their bookstores and make sure the right resources are being provided for the flock. It wouldn't be wise for a parent to keep rat poison on the pantry shelf, nor is it wise for pastors to leave false teachers and wolves on the shelves of the church bookstore in the name of chewing the meat and spitting out the bones. Think of the church bookstore as a spiritual grocery store and fill it with what you want people consuming. Travis, I went to a church for years and I love this church, but 80% of their library for most of my life was like Amish Christian romance novels.
I hate those.
And oh, dude, it was just I never read one, but I just
what
imagined
is it that makes those so popular?
I don't get it.
I don't want to like speak bad of like those authors, but like, can't you be original for once?
It's just Lifetime
like,
on
and
repeat.
even
That's really
even
what it
the
is.
cover art, like it's all the same. It's like, oh my word!
But they got it. But this is a serious point though, because what if in your church library, you don't want it looking like your local Christian bookstore's Christian, or the local bookstore's Christian section where it's Joyce Meyer and Joel Osteen and all these people, because you want to have resources like Costy's saying that you really want your people diving into, not this
and
other
you have
stuff.
to like going off of that, like doing your research. It also means like looking into the authors and their affiliates and things like that, because this is actually something that we've seen. We went back and we were talking, going back to our episode on the Enneagram and stuff, right? Now, I know people have different opinions on that, but like the major way a lot of those things made inroads into evangelical circles was through books. Like books those are the types of books that you'd find in a Christian bookstore or in a church library or things like that. That was just kind of the easy read bestseller types of stuff. Like that's
your best life now.
And through that, like came some really dangerous, I think some really dangerous teaching, and affiliated with some directly heretical false teachers, like you would never put that person in, but they're affiliated with this person that you put into your church library. So now you're making a pretty clear pathway to a direct false teacher that you would never put in your pulpits, things like that. So like it's just often overlooked. I love that he used the phrase, the kind of making fun of the people who use the phrase chewing the meat and spitting out the bones, because I remember not that long ago, it seems like certain phrases like that do become buzzwords. And this was a buzzword that was going around in evangelical circles. And often it was about things that I actually made a meme about this. It was like Photoshop chicken, where it was like just there was no meat on the chicken. And it was like when people say like chew the meat, spit out the bones, like the amount of meat to chew, kind of like meaning sometimes there's just no meat to chew. Sometimes it's just all bones. And I think this is often used as an excuse for things like that, where you're like, it's just not worth getting into it and eating that meal at all. But sorry, going on to what I really wanted to say after that little tangent there. It made me think about a conversation I just had with a local pastor who was actually talking about this as well. And he was mentioning the importance of pretty similar topic. He was mentioning the importance of reviewing even other teaching materials, such as those used in Sunday school classes. It's important to make sure that everything a church is putting out is true and aligns with the biblical standards they hold to. Obviously, the core biblical principles, right, that we all adhere to. But even in going down farther, there are different denominational standards or whatever. Like we hold to, my denomination holds to the Westminster standards and things like that. So there are certain authors that, maybe hold to a different standard, but are in a very similar camp that we would still use. But why would you put for someone that goes in direct opposition with all of those biblical standards that your church holds to? So make sure they're cohesive, they're in alignment there. Like that's just something that makes sense. Even someone who disagrees with the standards I hold to, like why would they do the same thing? Obviously, like I said, there's some minor, stances that we'd be like, okay, well, we can still benefit from that, but use wisdom there. And it's like we were talking about with the Sunday school teachers, like the Sunday school curriculums and things like that, it gets so overlooked sometimes. And we'll get to this point down the road, until like someone sits in on a Sunday school class, like who's in leadership, is like, what are they talking about? Like, what is going on here? So we want to avoid that. We'll talk about that point further on.
I don't know if I was sinning by doing this. I may have, and I might need to repent for this, but I used to go to like the Christian section of Barnes and Noble and flip around. Like I would go to like Joel Osteen's Your Best Life Now and just flip it around and cover. Now I understand I was making life horrible for the people that worked at that bookstore, but I was like, if one person does not see this title, but all in all, for Pete's sakes, get rid of the Amish romance novels from your church's bookstore.
Just for the sake of like good material, like it just, even in secular standards, like how unoriginal are you? And like, what is it? What is the goal? Like, that's my question, honestly. Can we just spend some time in this like rabbit trail? Because this is like another pet peeve of mine. But like, what's the goal of those authors? Like, how does that edify?
Oh, it's funny though. They all use the same color scheme. It's the same artwork. It's hilarious. But we should move on because
But I just want to say here that like even these little areas, like your bookstore or Sunday school, I know it's not coming from the pulpit to the whole congregation, but this is an opportunity where false teaching could occur. Even if those promoting and teaching it don't realize what they're doing, sometimes because they're not trained enough, which is a whole nother issue, which we've kind of talked about already. So these are important areas to look at within your church.
Yeah. So let's move on, because if we don't, I could spend all night trying to pick apart why Lifetime movies are good. Anyway, number 5 out of 6 on ways to weed out the wolves is simply this: preach hard. The article says wolves and false teachers hate hard preaching. And by hard, I mean truthful preaching loaded with scripture that targets the heart. Wolves don't mind you boringly spitting out information, but they can't stand it when you press in on transformation. They don't like applications and exhortations that go there, because they can feel their own heart pounding through their chest and feel like you're talking directly to them. Consistently sitting under easy preaching is enjoyable for wolves, but sitting under hard preaching is unbearable for them. The reason why wolves usually find a home in soft churches is for this reason. It's easy to leave every Sunday unchanged. But preaching hard will move people beyond information and into transformation by the power of the Holy Spirit. Mic drop, man. I was like, I read that earlier and I was like, I don't even need to add any commentary to that. That's just so good.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty practical, right? Like, how do you deal with false teachers and false teaching? There's church discipline, there's all these things, but like, preach the truth and equip the saints, right? If you have a church that has solid teaching, they're going to be better equipped to remove the mask on false teaching and see it for what it really is. And you're hopefully going to bring those false teachers and people promoting false teaching under condemnation and to repentance, right? So don't be a soft church. But this actually reminded me of another conversation I had with the pastor, where he had to lovingly remind members of his church that his goal and his responsibility was not to make them feel good, but to help conform them into the image of Christ, which means convicting of sin and calling Christians to walk in obedience, teaching the whole counsel of God, even when it's not what we want to hear. And when it's not what we not want to hear, that's when we need to hear it, right?
Amen. That's so important, right? It's that piece in there about like it's really easy to just sit under preaching that like tickles your ears. Just reminds me of like that moralistic therapeutic deism where it's just like, it strokes the ego and cool. Like I could feel good about myself on a Sunday and leave. But like you just said, when we don't want to hear the truth of the gospel, it's when we really need it, right? Because it makes us feel uncomfortable. It's supposed to transform us. That's not easy, but it's the responsibility of the pastor to preach the word day in and day out, and to not hold back.
I think it's like, I mean, this is a whole other podcast episode that we could do just on like preaching, but I think it's kind of a lot like that. Preaching is in some ways a lost art. Like we don't realize how this moralistic therapeutic preaching and teaching has infiltrated the church, and it's not always like so evident. Who was that? I was talking with another pastor, but we were talking about how like oftentimes, people wouldn't say they're preaching those kind of sermons. And they would often, these people are the same people who would very much be against legalism and moralistic thinking, but it's kind of, in a way, it ends up being moralistic in its own way when it's kind of that practical self-help stuff, which sometimes comes with the more topical preaching, right? Where you want to deal with individual aspects of your life, and there's some good elements there and truths there, but and it's not directly like do this, to earn favor with God, that kind of thing. But that's what it becomes sometimes, even when they don't intend it to, even when they don't realize what it is. And so I don't know. There's just this. It's hard to explain until you sit under like the different types of preaching and things like that. But anyway, so preach hard.
Yeah, preach hard. Preach hard. Number 6, the final one in our list of ways to weed out wolves, is implement systems for reporting up. This is a really practical one. This is what the article says. We've all seen this happen in the church. You sign up for a small group, and then you sign up to lead one, and then you get trained or not, and then you get deployed. It's a wonderful send-off, right? And then crickets. You're on your own island until one day a false teacher or a wolf gets into your group, and now you have to send up smoke signals, a barrage of text messages, and set off fire alarms to get any kind of help from disconnected leaders. A wise church requires reporting systems, right? We call this reporting up in church work. It means that communication from those who are in deep in the root system of church discipleship ministries can quickly send reports up to the leaders and get help. Like an infection getting treated before it turns ugly, good systems of ministry reporting mean that false teachers and wolves get dealt with quickly. And much more can be said, but my prayer is that these 6 steps are ones you've already taken in your church and will continue to monitor closely. If not, consider taking action to ensure that you are weeding out wolves and false teachers out of love and care for Christ's flock. And this is me speaking. I would add the word bride here. It's such a sweet term, out of love and care for Christ's bride.
Yeah, I like how he ended pointing out that it's out of love and care for Christ's flock, because I think, again, it gets such a negative reaction when you talk about calling out false teachers, dealing with false teachers, all this stuff. It seems so mean. And it should be motivated out of love, right? Even church discipline, right? We don't want to practice church discipline because we don't want to hurt the person's feelings or whatever. But we're doing it for their ultimate good. We're doing this for the church's ultimate good and for God's glory. It's not always a fun process, right? But it should be ultimately motivated out of love and care for Christ's flock. So I thought that was a good way to end. But I also wanted to go back and comment on this last point, because I can see people, especially people who have been maybe hurt by systems in the church being used in the wrong way. So I didn't want people to kind of dismiss this last point, because I think it's so practical. We do this in organizations all the time. It's just necessary when you're having groups of people, like to have good communication systems. But sometimes, and this is how it shouldn't be used, but people may view this as almost like a tattletale / secret police reporting system where congregants are paranoid that they're always being eavesdropped on.
Yeah, like Big Brother.
Right, kind of Big Brother thing. I'm sure there are churches where systems are in place and it's used this way, but that's not how it should be used. It's not to instill fear and be a power play. Well, yes, like false teachers should realize and be rightfully fearful that their false teaching will get called out. But that aside, like your average lay people, they shouldn't be in fear if those who are walking in obedience, those who aren't doing anything wrong, They shouldn't be in fear, and this is not to be used as a power play. It's a system of clear communication where the church can be confident that leaders are accessible to deal with matters that it is their God-given responsibility to take care of when it is needed, because God has given them those gifts and they have been trained, hopefully, and qualified, hopefully, to do so. Of course, they are responsible to handle those situations in a biblical manner. So what we're not saying is having the system in place is going to cure all your problems, especially if those people in those positions are not qualified, but that hopefully would have been taken care of in the points above, right? If we're doing all these things that he's suggesting and we're walking in a biblical manner. Hopefully this system that's in place should help the church really feel secure, not a false security, where they stop being on guard, but knowing their people are on guard. That should help make them feel secure in a good way and feel safe and build trust between leadership and the church lay people, not the opposite. So a lot depends on the character of the lay people and the leadership in the church. But in other words, having the right systems in place are crucial. They won't solve all your problems if the character involved is not handling the issues the way that they're supposed to. So you need both.
Being proactive in all of this is such a key part, as Costi mentioned early in the article, that when you can jump ahead and have all these systems in place, you can really protect the flock, protect the bride, sanctify the bride in ways that you just can't if you don't have a good church leadership set in place, with ways to make sure that the wolves can't get in.
Yeah. It's something that's super practical. Like one simple thing our church does, right, is state our responsibility as members to submit to church government and how we should act, that it's our right to keep, it's our responsibility to keep each other accountable and to edify one another, build each other up, those sorts of things. It's right there in our covenant of membership that we publicly declare as we join the church in front of the whole congregation. So that is putting it in front of those congregation members every time someone joins the church. But we can look back to that, and we have to look back to that in the future. If like, heaven forbid, like people have to practice church discipline on me, I can't say, well, sorry, I didn't know, play the innocence card. Yeah. Like, I know what I'm doing, and I know what my responsibility is. I know that I gave my word, before God and before the whole congregation of what I should do, and that I would submit to the church government. So that takes away any excuses I have. So I think it's those practical things that you can do that help when dealing with these things, or help hopefully preventing these situations from occurring in the first place.
So here's a question I have, and this is the reason I ask it is because I ask it almost rhetorically, because I kind of have a conviction on this, but I'm curious what your thoughts are. Elders. Should elders be involved in leading like the small group ministries in the church? Now, the reason I ask this is because, like, what happens, right? When you have small group ministries in the church, you have a bunch of small groups. Who leads them? It's usually somebody just says, I have the time, I'll try to lead it. But this person may not have any sort of spiritual guidance. They may not have any sort of spiritual accountability in their lives. So what happens when they start teaching things out of left field or going through a book by Joel Osteen? And then, what happens when you do that? The big issue is what Costi's saying with this last point is if you don't have an accountability system to report up what's happening, you're kind of just like blindly hoping that your small groups are going to get it right with no spiritual guidance and no spiritual accountability. And that can be a really scary place to be in, because like 80%, I would say, of all small group leaders are going to be trustworthy. They're doing the right things. But the problem is, why would you even open yourself up to the possibility of that 20% that might go rogue, that might be taking things out of context, coming at things from way out in left field. But I don't know. That's kind of a conviction I've had lately where I think elders in the church should definitely be a part of leading small groups as best as they can, rather than just blindly leaving that up to whoever volunteers to lead a group.
Yeah, well, it's kind of one of those things where I think you can make a good biblical argument there. Sometimes the whole small group thing just depends on how your church is set up anyway. So for some, they're
Very
like, well,
true.
this
Yeah.
doesn't even kind of apply. But in practice, it does. Like, how do you control different times of fellowship within a church where it's not all one body and you have different groups and you have teaching going on? Like, who should be doing that teaching? Now, sometimes, maybe more often than not, it ends up being the elders teaching, whether or not this is a policy they have. It ends up being the elders who are teaching these groups because they're normally the people who are qualified and naturally gifted and hope, that's they're passionate about doing it. And so it falls into place kind of naturally. So I'm not saying, they have to have that as a policy. Like you have to be an elder in a small group. It wouldn't be a bad idea though. And if not, like, it'd be great to have an elder in, each of those small groups to make sure that, and at the very least, like we were saying, have clear communication systems so that if a matter comes up, people in the small group know what to do. But in that case, it's like having someone already aware of the situations and knowing what's going on. I mean, that's a whole other thing, like having what's going to be taught in, obviously you can't prevent someone from offhandedly saying something, right? But if a curriculum is going to be taught and used in a small group, maybe have the elder team or some elders review it, or the pastoral team or whatever, right? That's a great way. Like you could do that for Sunday school, small group, that kind of thing. But having them involved in general and not disconnected probably would help eliminate those things. So I think it's a wise, practical thing, if not a biblical model. So
Definitely.
I definitely see how it could cause some issues. And like, so even if you had clear reporting systems, but they weren't involved in already, I can see how that would be a very could cause some feels like a tattletale thing, right? Like, how did they find out? Like they're coming to me, correcting me for my thing, and they weren't even around. So someone told on me. Like having someone directly involved already would be a lot better because they could directly go to that person.
And it keeps it from becoming a Big Brother situation to just simply discipleship. Mm-hmm. Like it's just.
I was just gonna say, I know we're running out of time, but I mean, part of that too, like there's a biblical model for correcting someone in sin, right? So obviously going to talking to them, but for some things, getting the elders involved, because maybe you have questions. Maybe it's like, was this false teaching? Those types of things. Just being available to a proper level as church leaderships and not being disconnected. And the more connected you can be is probably healthier. And just real quick, one kind of follow-up question on that is, how do larger churches handle these types of systems and situations like this, right? So right now I'm involved in a very small church plant, and so naturally our pastor is involved in our prayer services and our men's discipleship class and our so how it's not hard for that. There's not a big gap between all these things going on and leadership and knowing what's going on and what's being taught and everything, because a lot of it's, being spearheaded by him because we're so small. But how, like when you get so huge, and this would be a whole nother episode maybe on mega churches and things like that. But like, how do you, and I don't have an answer for this, but I can just see this being a compounded issue. The bigger you get, and the larger your, church staff gets and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know, just something to think about there.
Yeah, it's kind of like an oxymoron to say a local mega church, but there's a local mega church near us that I know people that have left that church because there's no spiritual accountability there. But yeah, it's interesting. Well, as we close out and we say thank you to For the Gospel for allowing us to go through these articles, and it's really helpful, really good stuff. But as we conclude, it's important for us to take seriously the qualifications and the characteristics of those trying to lead within the church, trying to be involved in the church, because, calling out false teaching is a biblical mandate. It is a mandate for us to be on guard to protect the bride of Christ. and be on guard against the wolves that come to destroy the local church, because that's what they're there to do, right? If they're a wolf, they're coming to feed on the sheep. And to be careless about this, well, frankly put, is to be careless about the bride of Christ. So let's take this seriously. Let's make sure that we are being on guard to proactively weed out the wolves before the issues are caused, and save the church a whole lot of issues and time and trouble. Well, thank you for joining us today on the Happy Holy Hour. If you have any questions, reach out to us. I had somebody reach out to us this week, Travis, that they're a listener of the podcast and they're a new follower in Christ. And I was able to hook them up through Westminster Bookstore. They did not have a Bible, so now they're getting a couple Bibles sent to them, and it's just really cool to make this impact. But none of that would have happened if they didn't reach out. So reach out to us, happyholyhour@gmail.com, or reach out to us over social media. We'd be glad to connect with you in that way. Remember to subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an episode. There's a lot of episodes out there. You see that they're all interconnected, as we mentioned earlier, and it's a lot of fun. Well, yeah, we might reference some things that you might not get fully if you don't listen to the other episodes. So go back and listen to them. Leave a review so others can find the show, because, well, the show's no good if people can't listen to it. So make sure you leave a review. It helps us get through those algorithms and reach more people for the gospel, for the glory of God. And if you are willing to pray for this podcast, pray for its progress as we move forward, but also consider donating financially. This podcast runs exclusively off the generosity of our listeners. We don't have advertisements because there ain't no time for advertisements. We're already hitting an hour plus as it is, as the Happy Holy Hour.
Yeah, we said this was going to be a short episode. And
yeah, we can't squeeze ads in here. Are you kidding me? So keep it that way, and hit up our GoFundMe.
Yeah,
you can find that in our show notes. And lastly, visit our website for other really helpful resources and the rest of our episode library. Until next week, God bless.
Preach hard and stop reading those Amish love stories. For Pete's sake, stop it. Stop it.
Stop. And stop watching Lifetime while you're at it.